Welcome to another episode of Stewart Squared. Today I'm going to just go right out with it and ask my father whether he had ever attended the Homebrew Club. And for those listeners who don't know, the Homebrew Club is where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met. Maybe we should hand it over to you to go deeper into it.
Formed Apple when they went to the Homebrew Club. The Homebrew Computer Club was essentially a user group for early enthusiasts of very early personal computers. And really, it's a bunch of engineers in Silicon Valley who would get together, and I can't remember exactly where it was, either on or near the Stanford campus. Or maybe kind of wherever they could get a room. But they'd get together and they'd start talking computers. And at the time, computers were chips. So the Motorola 6502 and the Intel, I can't remember what the chip number was, before they went to 4 digits, it was a 3-digit number. And there were other chips. And so these are engineers getting together talking about how to build personal computers before there were any personal computers. So one of the big events was when Steve and Woz brought the Apple I, which was just a board with a bunch of chips on it, to the Homebrew Computer Club, and everybody's like, yeah. So no, I never went to one, and but it was sort of rapid iteration back in the 70s, 74, 75, 76.
So it was before you showed up, and it was quite significantly before you showed up then, because you came in the 80, right?
Well, I moved in 83. We all moved in 83 to Redwood City, but I'd been there several times before, just visiting. So significantly before. People think I'm like part of the original personal computer industry, but no, I graduated college in 1975. So between 1975 and 1983, I lived in Boston with your mother, which is where your sisters were born. You were born in California in 85. And that's how I got into the tech business, because Boston was the hub. And in Boston, you had, Digital Equipment Corporation, Data General, all the mini computer companies, and software companies. And so the very first software application that succeeded on the Apple II was VisiCalc, done by Software Arts, which was located in Boston.
And what year was that?
They introduced VisiCalc, I think, in 79 on the Apple II, which had been introduced in 77 or 78. And it took off right away. And that was transformational, because people understood that software was actually something that made computers useful, as opposed to the other way around.
And it's so crazy. This is why I love doing the show, is because I have I key it. It's like there's a word for it, double click, when you double click on something, right? And then you can double click on the history. And I thought basically you just made it clear that 1975 to 1990 is the whole thing. I thought it all happened in the 1980s. So I thought Homebrew Club was happening in the 1980s.
I don't think it was being held anymore by 1980. I mean, I'd have to look it up.
So
yeah.
And that kind of ties together how the 1960s rolled into the 1970s, and why Steve Jobs was more into the counterculture, because he's got it right after Stewart Brand probably started his thing. That leads into the Homebrew Club.
Stewart Brand and the Homebrew Club, the Whole Earth Catalog and the Homebrew Club, probably contemporaneous. I mean, we have to look up the dates here, but because this is before I actually showed up full time. And so it's history for me that I didn't experience. A little vague. I started experiencing it with VisiCalc on the Apple II in like 1980.
And so you were in Boston, and there was a PC industry in Boston getting started, and there's also one in Texas, right? What can you draw out, like, while you were in Boston in the late 70s, seeing this thing happen, what was happening in Texas, and why did it ultimately get solidified in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, and there's always exceptions to that, of course, because Microsoft was founded 1974, 75, in Albuquerque. And they were in Albuquerque for like 18 months, and then Bill and Paul, who grew up in Seattle, said, screw this, let's move back home, which is why Microsoft's in Seattle, not in Silicon Valley. So there's exceptions to everything here. But in general, the mainframe and many computer businesses were East Coast based. The big companies all came out of other academic institutions or spinning out of research labs or whatever. And on the East Coast, and the West Coast did not start as a computer business until the personal computer started there. So there's overlapping things, right? The workstation business also was based in Silicon Valley. So Silicon Graphics and Sun Microsystems were founded before the personal computer came out. And they were kind of mini computers, and then overlapped with workstations, and then workstations overlapped with the personal computer. Everything is evolving all at the same time. So they're not distinct stages. But the transition from the East Coast to the West Coast happened because Intel was based there, because companies spun out of Intel. Sun Microsystems, Sun actually stands for Stanford University Network, because it was founded at Stanford and spun out, as was Google and other later companies. So, all of the ecosystem was there in time for the workstation and PC business, and derived off the chip business, and disk drive business, and all the other component businesses.
And so and we didn't get to the Texas part. I want to go into the Texas part where,
Texas is two things. I'm testing myself here, but one was Texas Instruments, which was a semiconductor company based in Texas, obviously. And they had a shot, this is generationally always true for the chip companies, they had a shot at making microprocessors for personal computers, but they were like, nah, it's like a small business, didn't matter. So they didn't focus on it. And so first Motorola and then Intel ran away with that business. Motorola, of course, was headquartered outside of Chicago, but had significant operations in Silicon Valley. So Motorola was the first chip to be adopted by Apple, but also I think adopted by Commodore. And then the second thing in Texas was Radio Shack. Radio Shack introduced one of the first personal computers, but it was a funny one because it was called the Trash 80 or the TRS 80, which is kind of like a tablet. And it had a kind of a keyboard on it. And I have to go look at the picture again to remember what it was like, but journalists adopted it right away because you could plug it into a modem and it was portable. And so you could transmit your stories through a modem early on. And journalists, of course, didn't want to have to carry a whole typewriter around. So they were the first adopters of that machine. And it was called Tandy Radio Shack. That's why it was TRS. And it was a public company. And so they made a pretty heroic effort to get into the personal computer business. But ultimately, they kind of went their own way because it's a little bit like Walmart making its own products. Tandy Radio Shack was a chain of retail stores, and they wanted to make stuff for the stores for people to buy. And they weren't totally focused on what customers wanted. So they were successful, and they were one of the players. Tandy Radio Shack, Commodore, and Apple were the first three hardware companies to find commercial success. And then, of course, the story changed when IBM got in the business and Microsoft licensed the operating system.
Yeah, okay, got it. Okay, so this is great. This is a whole bunch more context into what's going on over the whole United States. You have IBM in New York.
Third thing for Texas, which is Michael Dell started Dell Computers in his dorm room at UT Austin in Austin, Texas. And probably Dell's one of the largest employers in the state. Yeah. There's others too, like
later,
Compact Computer was based in Houston, and so there are other stories, but they didn't, Dell's still around.
How did Texas become a center of innovation? Like, what was going on there? Why were entrepreneurs? You have the East Coast as Edison probably starting pretty early, AT&T, all that stuff. West Coast, you've got Hewlett Packard before how did Texas come into the entrepreneurship scene?
Because Texas and everything's bigger in Texas. A lot of the technical training was done at UT Austin. They have a very good, big computer science department, and they graduate a lot of engineers. But SMU, Texas A&M actually has a pretty good computer science program. So there were institutions in Texas, and I think my comment wasn't totally facetious. It's like, in Texas we do things big, so you're allowed to think big, and so it was never a center of technology, but there were companies started in Texas that envisioned bigger things like Compaq, and Ben Rosen, I think, lived in Dallas, so the original newsletter and conference business was headquartered in Texas. They're just intersection points. But I mean, you could do that in Atlanta too. Atlanta, Georgia Tech produced a lot of very talented engineers. Some of those started companies, and it's not so much a legacy now, but back in the day, there was a significant tech center in Georgia, and Seattle, of course, and Boston. New York only came on later.
So, okay, this ties in with a recent thread of mine, which will probably lead us deeply into political and historical threads, which is that something happened in the 1930s with the rise of big science. And big science really came about once we started to harness the power of the atom with the Manhattan Project, where all of a sudden science went from this gentleman, scholar, rich aristocrat hanging out in England and just tinkering with stuff, all of a sudden to a matter of important national security when they harnessed the power of atoms and launched a bomb on Japan, and everybody's like, oh shit, we gotta clamp down on this and get this thing. And so there's something with these research universities, industry, and the government, and there's some thing going on there, and that's what solidified Silicon Valley as the place where all of a sudden, forget Boston, forget Texas, forget all of these other places. In order to do this, you have to move to Silicon Valley. When did that become real?
It's really two orthogonal timelines, but there's a book about this. The trigger for Silicon Valley was
Shockley.
William Shockley, who moved from working at Edison Labs or AT&T?
No, Bell Labs.
AT&T, Bell Labs, yeah. So Bell Labs, and he moved, this is the premise of the book, he moved from New York, New Jersey to Menlo Park, where his mother was, to be with his mother. And the result of that was Silicon Valley. There's a lot of nuance in that. But he started recruiting people for a semiconductor company, Shockley Labs, and he recruited them out of the other engineering companies like Raytheon and Hewlett Packard hadn't really started, or they were in a different business. But so that was really the nucleus that led to Silicon Valley as a nexus between academia and enterprise. But the other thing is you're referring to what's often referred to as the military-industrial complex, which grew out of World War II. So it was later. I mean, when you put them in the timeline, they're not continuous, not contiguous. And so that's why I say it's two orthogonal timelines. The military-industrial complex out of World War II and into the Cold War, we had these gigantic defense companies that had been born out of World War II and had a huge defense business selling stuff to the government, but weapon systems mainly. That was a military-industrial complex. So the resistance to the Vietnam War was resistance to the military-industrial complex because it had become so unbred. But that inbreeding kept going. to the point where there's only now 5 legacy primes. And those 5 represent a consolidation of about 15 or 20 companies over a period of 20 or 30 years. So anyway, those are the 2 timelines.
So, yeah, well, but and I'm going to add a third one here, because that's not the timeline where you went to Silicon Valley all of a sudden recognizing that it was no longer in Boston, it was somewhere out west. So there's like a question there of like whether that's true, whether it's
to be clear, I made a job decision, which was IDG published InfoWorld on the West Coast. The editor was fired, and I put my hat in the ring, and they made me editor of InfoWorld. So I had to move. And the move decision happened within 2 weeks, right? I got the job offer, turned to your mother and said, okay, we're going to California, which is why you were born there.
Out west. We're going out west.
Young man.
And it's funny because now I'm going south, because there was nowhere west to go anymore unless I wanted to go to east, go to China. Which did kind of happen in 2006. There was a sort of like, okay, well, we can't go west anymore, so like a bunch of Americans moved to China. But that's a tangent. We want to focus on
very different thing.
Yeah, we want to focus on the IDG, the job decision, because at some point after that, regardless of those 2 threads that we were talking about, which are foundational to the thing, somewhere along the line between 1980 and 2020, all of a sudden, in order to do it, you had to go to Silicon Valley. And it completely eclipsed Texas, which was in the 1980s still a player. What made that happen?
And eclipsed Boston and everything else. Silicon Valley became the center of everything. And a lot of people studied this, and there's a lot of palaver about it. But there was a true nexus between research, whether it was Stanford Research Institute, SRI, or Xerox PARC, or things that have been located in Silicon Valley because of the engineering talent there, and so not strictly speaking academia, but research. There was a lot of focus on inventing new things, and capital, and attitude is probably the only way to put it, which is it's okay to start companies, don't always succeed, and then you had venture capitalists willing to bet on things. Venture capital started in Silicon Valley with Arthur Rock. Actually started earlier in Boston with General Dorio. But these were wealthy individuals who kind of knew enough about what was going on to be plugged in and to make bets. So Arthur Rock wrote the first check for Apple and for Intel, I believe. And so having those wealthy individuals who understood what was going on was the capital angle. And then capital got formalized as venture capital in the late 70s, with the very few first firms. The first NEA fund was $7 million, something like that, and the first Kleiner fund was like $8 million. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Yeah, but they were very small amounts of money could produce huge returns, and that was the fundamental idea of venture capital. So you had this nexus between academic and corporate institutions doing research, engineers who were entrepreneurial and were willing to take chances or were driven out of things, and money. And so that was a perfect storm in Silicon Valley, right at the moment when the personal computer started. But that was, it all came together, and you had these young people who were graduated from college and didn't have other jobs, who had these wild ideas. And so it's just a fertile, it had been built up over decades, but it just hit that moment where chips, computers, software, components all happen in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. And you just happened to be there at the right time at the right place.
I had a job decision.
Very
I decided
core.
to take a job in California, and so we went there. And I'm looking around and going, wow. I think I've said this anecdote before, but on one of my trips out to California before we moved in like 80 or 81, I stayed at the Holiday Inn in Palo Alto, and there were only 2 hotels in downtown Palo Alto. Holiday Inn, I can't remember what the other one was, and then there was another one down the road. But I happened to stay at the Holiday Inn, and I went down to breakfast, and by myself. So I'm sitting at a table and I'm reading a newspaper, and I'm just listening to the conversation. Every table around me was talking about technology, venture capital, something like that, right? Disk drives or whatever it was. And I formed this impression in my head of Boston was one thing, mini computers. Georgia was one thing, comms, communications. And so in Silicon Valley, it was everything, right? So there wasn't just one hub, there were multiple hubs. You had the disk drive business, mostly in Scotts Valley. You had the chip business around Intel and Motorola's operations there. And you had a dawning computer business, which started to happen. And so everybody was only talking about technology, whether it was about how it was financed or where it was headed or what it was. And I'm sitting there in this going like, wow, this is amazing.
That is a new anecdote. I have not heard that. I really like that one. Something big I got there was that it was not just a component like the comms. I want to understand what comms mean because I don't understand what exactly mean, but but also the platform itself, so that not only you could have one of those components, but you have a whole bunch of people working on all those different components, but they put it all together into the computer itself, the personal computer. Is that right?
The PCs, I mean, Commodore was in Pennsylvania. Tandy was in Texas. So the only company that was actually there building a computer that wasn't a workstation company or, there's a bunch of other companies, was Apple. And so they were born out of Silicon Valley. Both Steve and Woz were born in Cupertino and raised there. Started the company there. And they also were of an age where, particularly Steve, there was a lot of counterculture in it, because if you were born in 1950s, you came of age at the very time when we were withdrawing from Vietnam, and the college protests had been happening, and there was a strong counterculture, and we became adults in that counterculture. And so they did not want to go work for big companies. They didn't want to do mainframes. They didn't want to do that old stuff, right? So there was a sense of, wow, personal computer, this is brand new. And it was brand new, and you had to invent how to make a personal computer. You had to invent how to write the software for a personal computer, both in terms of programming languages and applications development. All of it was new, even how to distribute it.
Man, it's directly related to the counterculture because it's all about no baggage. There's no historical baggage. We're starting completely new, completely fresh, and the only place we can do it is in California, where all the hippies are, where they're all young. But some of those hippies were
San
old by the
Francisco
time
and Silicon Valley, right next to each other.
Yeah. But it always surprised me because San Francisco is so hippy dippy and so crazy and
Silicon
artistic.
Valley and San Francisco were two different phenomena.
Boring.
There was no overlap.
So boring
until more recently when you had the social media companies.
Ooh, I think we're going to have to go down that tangent because Silicon Valley growing up, I was very bored my whole life. But then the first time I went to San Francisco, I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. This is really new. And I couldn't find another place to replace it. I traveled all over the world, and I couldn't find anything that matched what was going on in San Francisco. Can you talk about why you moved there in 2006, 2007?
So, no, I moved into that's right. I moved into San Francisco. To get the dates straight, which I should do because we're being recorded and transcribed. It will go into my book. So we moved to Redwood City because I took a job with a company that was originally based in Palo Alto and then moved to Menlo Park. So I found a house close by. And then 1996, I became a venture capitalist. 2006. So I moved into somewhere in between there. After 1996, like 99, I moved into the city, something like that, somewhere in there.
No, it's later. It's got to be later because in 2003, I was in San Francisco at Natalie's apartment for the Iraq War. And then with the start of the Iraq War, and then you had not moved out there because you were still down in Redwood City on Edgewood.
Yeah. So I moved in, and we started Alsop blew in 2006, and we started talking to each other in 2005. So I moved in 2004 and lived in the Presidio until I bought the house on
Larkin.
So, and during that period, I mean, I'd have to think about this to get the timeline straight, but the center of Silicon Valley moved north incrementally over time. So the original semiconductor companies were based in Silicon Valley, Milpitas and Cupertino and stuff, because there wasn't much there. It was a bunch of orchards, and they could buy a lot of land and build these factories.
Next to Stanford, too, right? Next to Stanford was a key part.
Right. People headed south from Stanford. And so then when it became more of a software business, like Electronic Arts was started in Redwood City, in San Mateo, and that became a hub of software, right? And so then software became more and more important, and the internet happened, and we had internet companies in San Francisco. And so San Francisco got its own tech culture, which is quite different than the one in early.
Wait, how is it different? Can you go in more? How is early San Francisco 2008, Airbnb, Dropbox, YC? How is that different than the 1980s, 1990s Silicon Valley?
Because there's the whole thing about scale, right? It had gotten big enough that you could do a lot of anything, and YC was a total example of that. And then, I could never get my head around the fact that you can scale the starting of companies, and you could have thousands of them. Introduce 120 every quarter.
And that's because when you saw that initial phase start, there weren't a lot of companies. Yeah. It was a small click,
and people would take chances to do something technically significant, and you could evaluate the technical significance of it and make a bet on it if you knew enough to do that. So I still don't really understand the idea of multi-billion-dollar venture capital companies. I'm anachronistic in that regard, which is why I'm trying to start a small one again. So I lost track of where
scaling software, scaling hardware. San Francisco was a place where people scaled software
and people, companies. The starting of companies, entrepreneurship became a career. Colleges started having entrepreneurship programs. Stanford was one of the first, and Stanford had the hell was it called? The
StartX.
Well, no, StartX was later. They started with there was something in between Homebrew and StartX that they did on campus. It was like a monthly meeting where venture capitalists would always show up to hear what students were up to, pre-StartX. Anyway, so, the ecosystem encouraged scale, and that's why I think I'm somewhat anachronistic, because I don't really understand that when it comes to what I consider to be a craft, which is investing capital in startups and making money off that. There is a way of thinking about it. The way I have of thinking about it is you start small, a little bit of money, and make a lot. You don't start with a lot, because it's really hard to scale a lot, and I just can't get my head around that. But, Andreessen Horowitz et al. Have scale.
Yeah, but there's something weird that happened, I think, and I think ultimately you're probably going to be proven right, that there's something weird happened in 2006, 2005, once the subprime mortgage crisis thing started to get something about low to zero interest rates and money printing and other things started to infect the system.
So 2008. Well, no, I mean 2008 was a mortgage crisis.
But Japan had gone into negative interest rates. Like that thinking was starting to already affect our country, and I think that led to a weird historical artifact of moving away from practicality.
I would agree with that. I don't know if I agree on the source of that, but because it's I call it this. I mean, people refer to it as the ZIRP period, zero interest rate period, and ZIRP led to a thing where it warped all of the financial decisions, and it did have an effect ultimately, right? Which we're in kind of the reverb of now, because we don't have zero interest rates anymore, and people are trying to know, how did you deal with that when you didn't have free money? There's a whole generation went through ZIRP, and
Yeah, it's a decade of free money.
And so, and in the interim, I mean, this is pretty high level. In the interim, it's not just social media; it's the sort of liquidity of a zero interest rate period meant you could make all kinds of decisions and not pay the price for it. And so your company might fail, and you start another one, or go get a job, or all of this was very fluid. And interesting. And now we're on the other side of that, and we don't really have institutional memory of what it was like back then, right? But this happens all the time because the Depression crowd, the people that grew up in the Depression when it was really crappy, and then World War II, those people had an attitude that the next generation did not have, because I was the next generation born in the 50s. Oh my God, the first 20 years of my life was like an economic boom. And, Camelot and JFK, and we're like the superpower. And then suddenly that turned into a negative. And so every generation has its own formed lived experiences that lead it to understand how to deal. And now we're in a place where I think multiple of our generations actually don't know how to deal with what's going on, including AI. We're sitting here going like, Trump, AI, conflicts all over the place, people killing each other. It's like, where the hell did the Indians start throwing bombs in Pakistan? Like, what? I didn't even know that.
Getting chaotic. And it's not. And it didn't even just begin. It's been since building. 2020, probably 2016, 2018, where it started to be like, oh, this is a new thing. We're in a new thing now. And I'm now excited about it because now I feel like I've adjusted to the new chaos, and I think I've always probably lived better in chaos than.
But this is one of my theories. You played a lot of video games growing up. You learned how to deal with chaos and post-chaos in a video game, and I actually think that was a huge social benefit for the generation that started with video games, because you learn how to make decisions fast and with multiple inputs. And I've actually never really been good at playing games, so I'm a slow processor, and which I think
let's
is good.
Get into the reality disturbance, because there's one thing about the there's one thing that says the next generation is always screwed up. Like there's that thing so that's real, but then at the same time, it does feel like the generation coming after me is also screwed up because of how in depth they are.
The speed with which this change happens, right? The generation before me was the Depression generation. They had gone through this whole 20-year experience of Depression and World War, and then had us, and then us matured into this world, which was not so easy to understand, but the generations are spinning faster now. So, what your niece and nephew are experiencing is, from our point of view, chaotic, because how the hell do they deal with this stuff?
But when I hang out with them, they feel sort of like adapted to it, but at the same time, I'm not sure if they're the best examples, but other young people seem like they have no hope or no chance of sort of the dependency is so strong on the technology that there's no thinking there, and AI is going to change that.
I'm an old fart sitting here thinking, these young people don't know what the hell they're doing. I actually think they know more than we do, because they've learned to adapt, and the ability of humans to adapt has moved faster and faster as each generation has come along, as technology has become more fluid and more embedded. So I actually, I'll be dead by the time that there are adults, even like you are, and they will have figured it out, and they will manage in that environment. And so humans are infinitely adaptable, and I rely on that.
Yeah, I like that thesis, that it's just like the adaptation. We're so strongly adapted, but it's not like a nice process, because I would say over the past 10 years, I've had to do an adaptation. Like if I had done that adaptation when I was younger, it would have been easier and smoother. But because of all of the opportunities to distract myself from that adaptation, I did it when I was older, and it was much harder. And I feel like the same thing is going to happen with this generation, that there's a hard limit that they can't live in the delusion that the technology gives them. And so that there's a necessity to adapt
So let me go
later.
Let me go really high level.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What we view as the pace of change will not be the way they view the pace of change. So sort of existential change will look different in future generations. So from their point of view, that if the technology is the assumption, AI is everywhere, then they'll find a different way of measuring change, which will be inherently adapted to the current conditions. Now, remember, we have 7, maybe 8 billion people on the Earth. We're talking about a pretty small sliver, extremely educated, highly motivated individuals versus the general population.
And that's a very, very key distinction. I really like the different relationship to time and a different relationship to change. The existential problems are always going to be there. Like there's no way to get around the existential problems, but the sort of problems of day-to-day life change with more technology.
The definition of existential changes.
Can you go more into that?
Well, I'm just saying what I thought. What I think is existential is not how it's defined by younger generations, younger than you. And existential means this is a fundamental threat to your existence, right? Existential. So a lot of people are reacting to the advancement of AI in such a rapid fashion as an existential threat.
And you don't have that. I don't either. No. But you don't have that existential.
I've just kind of been through so many of the technology transitions. I'm going, yeah, well, this looks like it did before. And I, so it's my superpower. I can see things other people can't. And so I can envision a world that where humans use AI and become empowered by it. And I don't think I can personally, right? I'm still, like I sit here and I go, we're going to try to write this book, and you're publishing all of our episodes and transcripts in Notion, and I never learned how to use Notion. So I go like, what the hell do I do now? I can't, I'm slow to absorb this stuff. I'm trying, but my pace of absorption is.
So one practical question. What is the, should I give it to you in Google Docs?
That would probably be easier for me.
Okay, I'll start doing
I know how to
Docs.
use Google Docs. Even Google Docs, I mean, I could give Google an earful, but
because there's an interesting can of worms you just opened up about Microsoft, because it's probably Microsoft Word that you're most adapted to.
No, I'm more adapted to Google Docs now.
Okay, all right.
Word is used only because other people send me Word documents. So I open them in Word, and I have Word. And there are just a lot of people out there that have not moved as fast as I have. I should not tell this story publicly, but my brother Joe I offered to buy opera tickets because they've taken it coming out to Santa Fe for the opera in August. And so I offered to buy the tickets. And he said he'd pay me back, and he sent me a check. I was trying to figure out, gee, Joe, have you ever heard of like Venmo or Zelle? I didn't get a response to that email, but he'll probably send me a check. But I know how to deposit a check virtually now. I don't actually have to go to the bank anymore. So, that's 7 years.
Well, but it's funny because my accountant, I just got I went back to my old accountant, who is all paper. He had a real-time trouble trying to, get me in Argentina to figure out how we're going to do our taxes, because he does it in paper, and he wanted me to send paper to him from Argentina. But we figured that out to get it online. And then I asked him, how do I pay you? And he's like, well, I only accept check. So it's the same problem as the paper-based thing.
Well,
and he's like 50.
Yeah, you can people who write checks know how to give you wire instructions. You could use the wire instructions to do an ACH transfer. So it's a I have had to figure this out myself. We don't actually write any checks anymore. We do still tell the bank to send a few checks to people that can only understand a check, but the list has gotten shorter and shorter over time because we have so many other ways to pay for stuff.
Okay, so for the last 5 to 10 minutes, let's take on that rabbit hole about reality disturbance, because you've got a fun reality disturbance, and we were talking about young people. They have a different understanding of reality and adapt to different reality, but this reality is going to get disturbed, and not only visual reality, cultural reality, artificial intelligence, the fact that money is like not a real paper thing.
Money has never been a real thing. Money has always been a system to represent barter. In essence, right? Used to be that you would exchange goods, right? Then somebody said, well, we could have like paper money and it represents a certain value, and if you value both sides, we can exchange things through this intermediary. Finance is purely information. It's all data. And which is this is the only reason it makes it interesting to me, is because I can't figure out that. And our systems, this is one of those systemic things, our systems are built on technology that's been developed over time. So a lot of the systems are developed. The air traffic control system has the same problem. Like, how do you completely renovate a system? So China doesn't have that legacy system. So they have built their system in a way that no one ever touches money or cards or anything else. Everything runs through WeChat. I was listening to your Uncle Ian talk about this because he just spent 6 weeks over, most of it in China. He said he realized that they had such a different system that he couldn't use anything that he had. His credit cards, the only thing that works is Apple Pay, because Apple Pay exists in both places, and Apple's done the work to translate to a Chinese system for Chinese customers. And it works if you're an American going there. I'm not sure I want to rely on that, but they have a completely different financial system than we do, because they didn't have any legacy, and we can't figure out how to get rid of the legacy.
So, but there are opportunities, that you mentioned China leapfrogged us because they came in at a different time, but there are opportunities, and maybe we can talk about the history of this. There are opportunities where we, with the previous infrastructure, are allowed to leapfrog within the own system because the new technology is so potent. And I feel like I'm talking about AI here, right? Where it's like, I now have the
leapfrog. But AI, that's part of the promise of AI, that you can renovate whole systems without having to go through the pain of suffering of what classically is referred to in Silicon Valley as flying a 747 and changing the engines in flight.
Yeah.
But
so what other technologies besides AI has allowed for that?
I went to South Africa in 1985. I actually don't remember, but and I went to Johannesburg, and then I went out on a field trip on safari, just one day. And cell phone, South Africa adopted GSM. They had no wired telephone infrastructure because it's a poor country. They had, the rich white people who ran apartheid had telephones they could call each other on, but none of the black people, majority of the population, had no access to wired telephones. But cell phones showed up, and they adopted cell phone technology much faster. And so there's never been a wired infrastructure in South Africa or in most of the rest of Africa. And that's an example of where if you're either held back or very advanced, you can make transitions really quickly, but in between it gets really complicated. So we built our industrial infrastructure out of World War II. Prior to World War II, and we knew how to make cars and airplanes, mainly for our own market. And when the war happened, the government just like shifted and said, okay, stop doing all those things and start using that manufacturing capability to make tanks and ships and blah, blah. So we were able to pivot our infrastructure very quickly, and that gave us this huge advantage because the rest of the world was decimated. Europe and Japan were, I mean, literally decimated, and they had to rebuild, and we supplied all of that stuff. And now we have to live with all that. And so maybe AI can introduce enough fluidity into the system. Like you look at the thing that Doge is accused of doing, which is going and finding out about our personal Social Security information or tax information. What they're doing is they're trying to dive under and figure out how to rebuild the system from the ground up so that it doesn't require as many people, so that it is more efficient, it gives better customer service, all of the things that Silicon Valley does that the government has a hard time. And underlying that is, in my opinion, the only way to do that is to tear the old system down, which is what just pisses everybody off, get everybody upset. But it's the only way to do it because you can't, we've got what we've got, and it's been developed over the last 50 years. And we still have old mainframes running COBOL in the back of this.
So what I got from that is essentially that AI might be a fundamentally new technology, because I think that it would allow, like, for example, what it's given me, I've now leapfrogged programmers. I'm now able to do things programmers can't, and only because of their imagination on what AI can do. They can do it, and they can probably do it much better than me, but they can't do it as quickly as me because they think that they have to go through step by step and step. And maybe to do it right, you have to do that for now, not in a year, not in 2 years. My way will be better in that I think in that period. So it's allowing me to leapfrog. So I imagine it allows other people to leapfrog. Then there's the sort of bringing manufacturing back. You accurately tracked the disappearance of manufacturing in the United States, but it could come back now because we have this leapfrog technology, but not in the way it worked before, which is employing millions of people. Like, that feels like it's out the window. It's not coming back.
Well, there's a hard thing to do, which is actually making chips and systems and plugging them all together, which we were capable of doing and did do. ASML is a really interesting company because it's the one that enables lithography that allows you to print chips, and that's actually a Dutch company. But they have maintained their hold on that business. And, of course, TSMC is a Taiwanese company, and so there are places, not in China, but China has this overwhelming supply chain advantage. And they do a lot of the functions that we used to do in Silicon Valley of making things. And making things is still hard to do. There are, my own company, Ursa Major, has figured out how to 3D print hard metal products, making rocket engines. Much more durable and much faster to build, much faster to design. And they're using that as an advantage to become competitive. That's a making thing. And it's possible you can see that we can reinvent the making of things in a way that doesn't involve the processes that have already existed, and in that way leapfrog China. But it's probably not by going back and trying to do it the way China's doing it. You have to reinvent the whole process.
Ooh, I like that. That feels like an opportunity there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a known opportunity to listen to or read what Gilton is involved in writing. He's explicit about it.
Cool.
It's called additive manufacturing versus repetitive.
Yeah, and I got a little taste of that in our episode that we did with him. Well, that's cool. That's awesome. Next time or another time, we'll talk about what would be good to talk about, which is like what your approach to company formation is and how to think about all the little gotchas in terms of both investing angles and all those things that you've learned over a long period of time, I imagine through a lot of pain and suffering.
I can talk about I'm
right?
going through it right now.
Yeah.
I have a company. If we don't get a term sheet for it to be acquired tomorrow morning, we're going to have to shut it down.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. We'll do an institutional knowledge transfer there. Well, thank you so much.